This episode of Shadowversity is brought to you by the release of my debut novel, Shadow of the Conqueror, Book 1 in Chronicles of Everfall, where the hero is also the villain. And because it makes sense when you read it. For who better to fight back the darkness of the world than the one responsible for most of it? It's available in ebook, print, and hardcover. The audiobook is coming very soon. And if you love epic fantasy on a grand scale, you'll love it.
Shadowversity.
Greetings, I'm Shad, and we have a bit of a special episode of Fantasy Rearmed here because, as you've probably been able to tell, I'm holding something rather awesome. This is a cosplay kind of version reproduction of the sword in my debut novel, Shadow of the Conqueror, Book 1 in Chronicles of Everfall. And the name of this sword is Imperius, and it's going to give us a great reference point to the subject of this video, which is how would fantasy materials and indeed enchantments affect sword design, because that is exactly what I've done with my sword here. And then through describing the logical kind of process that I went into designing this sword, I'll also reference some of the other classic sword materials like, say, mithril or adamantium, because it doesn't apply to fantasy, it's also pop culture and sci-fi. And then hopefully that will inspire and give you a kind of a logical baseline or inspiration as to the way to approach this concept, this idea. And before we dive right into the meat of this video, I need, and of course, like, it's my privilege to give a shout out to Quantum Leap Cosplay, who made Imperius for me. His YouTube channel is awesome, and he is making such great content with a different kind of cosplay build with each episode. One where it's just a montage of him putting it together, kind of like a speed build, and another a voiced over commentary of how he actually did it. He's got the very build video of this awesome cosplay sword right here, Imperius, on his channel, so please do go check him out. And of course, subscribe. Links to his YouTube channel in the description below. So looking at Imperius, what are some of the differences in design that you'd be able to just have a look from a cursory glance? Well, you might not be able to tell, actually, because one of the big differences that Imperius has is in regards to its length. For a one-handed sword, this sword blade length is huge.
Giant, beautiful, massive.
So, in my other hand, I have a very historically accurate one-handed arming sword, and have a look at the difference in blade length. In fact, the blade length of Imperius is closer to a two-handed longsword than a one-handed arming sword. Check this out. So this is the longsword I was wearing at my side. Like, beautifully, historically accurate sword. You might have seen it on Scarlegrim's channel. Awesome sword. Now, let's compare the blade length. Imperius is actually still longer than you know, like when I say standard longsword, this one is actually on the longer end of the spectrum with longsword lengths. There are longer ones, okay, but there are more shorter ones than this than there are longer ones. And yeah, have a look at the blade lengths. So then, why does Imperius have such a long blade? And of course, why would you want a longer blade on a weapon? And if you do want a longer blade, why aren't they longer than the standard conventional lengths of swords, both one-handed and two-handed? Well, it all comes down to the material properties of what they're made out of. Swords, historically, made out of steel. And yes, I know iron as well as bronze, but look, medieval period, we're going to focus on steel, okay? Now, steel has certain mechanical limitations in regards to its strength, its flex and stuff like that. And so the standard length that you see with, say, long swords and arming swords are kind of the optimal properties and lengths depending on certain small variations. Like, for instance, the arming swords that are a little bit longer, a little bit beefier historically is because that's the purpose behind them. They want a bit more bite in the cut, all right? And perhaps they want a little bit more reach. This one, the long sword I'm wearing right here, is a thrusting beast, okay? Have a look at just how tapered this tip is. It is vicious, but it's actually quite effective in cutting from tests that have been done online. Medieval Review had a version of the sword testing, quite effective at cutting as well. And so this is a really beautiful balance in getting kind of the optimal shape to get good cutting and also devastating thrusts. But increasing the length of this blade would throw off the balance in a big way, and it would actually, in my opinion, result as a worse sword overall, because regardless of its cutting ability and also its thrusting capacity. It's also its versatility, how easy it is to redirect the blade and use in combat. All these things need to be taken into account when a sword is being made and designed. And one of the biggest things that will determine how it's designed is the materials that it's made out of. But if it was made out of a material that had different properties, for instance, the weight to strength ratio it has, and you might say, well, there are already kind of materials that do that, say like titanium. Titanium is crap at holding an edge, all right? Steel is one of the very best materials to make swords out of, even in the modern day. We make them out of modern steels, really high quality, incredible stuff. So still better than the historical counterparts that, yes, they were made out of steel, our steels are just better. And we haven't really come across a different material that's better than steel for swords. But in fantasy, we are not limited with that limitation. So then, what are the material properties of Imperius that has led me through kind of trying to assess this logically to such a design with it having such a longer blade? Well, one of the things is its weight, okay? Now, in my book setting, this item, this is essentially an enchanted sword, but there's not the traditional kind of magic in my setting. There's magic, but the magic system is what's called a hard magic system with very strict rules and parameters on how it's worked. And it's actually treated more of a science almost. So a little bit of setting information for my book. In this setting, light of the actual physical light of the world is magical. It's not like regular light in our universe, and it is the fuel source for the magic that exists in the book. And they have developed a technology called sun forging, where they are able to bond this magical light to physical objects. And when that happens, a supernatural process happens in the object, one, making it near indestructible. There are two things that will cause these items to shatter instantly, so they have some devastating weaknesses in the context of my book setting. So the items when sun forged are called sunicles. Okay, mechanical properties. I said they're near indestructible. What about the weight? Okay, how does the weight work into this? Well, sunicles are made out of whatever object that you're bonding light to, and whatever weight the object originally had, it will retain that weight. And so sunicles are often made out of light woods, timber basically, carved, okay? And then you bond light to them and they become sunicles, and whatever color they originally had, they kind of retain that color and then turn into a translucent precious stone. They might look like, you know, a blue diamond or a red ruby or something like that. And you get the color simply by painting the wood or staining the wood, whatever you want, before the sun forging process. And so Imperius actually is really, really light. Now, it was carved with the intention of it being sun-forged, becoming enchanted, and so because of that, they knew it was going to be near indestructible, and so the blade, this is something you can't replicate with a foam version, is incredibly thin. We're talking about 1 millimeter to 0.5 millimeter, thinner than you would ever be able to get away with a sword. Why can't we do that with swords? Well, they'd be way too flexible and floppy. They wouldn't be able to hold their strength when, you know, you're striking against an opponent, stuff like that, so we can't do that with regular swords, but in a fantasy setting, you can. Why would you want a sword to be so incredibly thin? Well, that means when you strike, when you cut someone, okay, there's less material that needs to be pushed aside. No matter how insanely magically sharp an edge is, if it can't push aside the material, if there's too much resistance, it can get jammed in that material, okay, especially if it's steel or something like that. And so the thinner the blade, the less distance the material needs to be pushed apart to cut. And so that's a huge mechanical advantage if your sword could be designed this way, if you had a material that could still keep it rigid and strong with being so light. And so this is one, you know, additional design difference you can put to fantasy swords if you have the fantasy material that allows the weapon to retain its strength and form while being so thin. Because remember, sunicles are effectively indestructible except for those horrible weaknesses that I mentioned. And so while being so indestructible, it's also so light because it's such thin wood. And that means it can be way, way longer. Now, how long would you want it? And is there such a thing as too long? Well, yes, there is such a thing as too long. For instance, versatility and function, okay? If this sword was like hugely long and stuff like that, as soon as you do a strike and you're coming low, you can easily hit the ground and it can get in the way. And so there are limits to the length that you want, but by having it longer, you can get way more reach on your opponent. Like if you could actually have a sword that had these material, you know, properties as Imperius in the real world, and you were fighting someone, not only with like a one-handed sword, but even a long sword like this, okay, the advantage you would have in reach, and because it's so light, it would be devastatingly fast. And so we're just talking about material advantages, not even magical enchantments yet. And if you had these material advantages because the weapon is made out of a fantasy material, you would have such an insane advantage over your opponent. And so a lot of what I'm kind of talking about here in regards to Sunicles can also be applied with, say, Mithril, depending on how the setting treats Mithril. In Lord of the Rings, Mithril is like insanely strong, but also incredibly light. Similar properties that we've kind of been talking about, but I wonder if there's a limit because, like, you know, Imperius being like 0.5 mil thick on the actual cutting plane, I'm not sure if that is too thin for Mithril and if it would have too much flex and stuff like that. And so you would get to determine this in your own setting. Dungeons & Dragons and other fantasies interpret Mithril being as strong as steel, but almost twice as light. That's a huge advantage, but it means you wouldn't be able to make the blade nearly as thin, because if it's just as strong as steel, that means it needs the same amount of thickness to retain the rigidity of the weapon when you strike. You do want to measure a flex. You want it to be hugely flexible with huge amount of resistance to get it to flex, which means massively rigid, okay, but when put under the massive strain and stress, it'll flex and then bend back. That's kind of what you're going for in regards to sword. So just saying it's massively flexible isn't necessarily advantage. You want it to be resistant to flexing, but having the capacity to flex with enough force. And if you have a material that is simply twice as strong as steel, but weighs about the same, and this is like adamantine or some other materials, and adamantium is kind of in the same regard, well, that means if it's the same weight, you might not be able to get away with having it longer than the average length of weapons, because you need the balance to get the versatility, but it means you probably could get away with it being so much thinner because it's so much stronger, able to resist the flex, and it would cut devastatingly effectively because it's so thin, just like a razor blade through flesh. And if it's stronger, it means it can retain the edge for much, much longer. Why is edge retention so good? Well, that means if it's thin, it doesn't need to push apart material very much, and it's still able to cut into things. That means it can keep cutting once it goes through. With regular steel, when you strike something, as soon as it strikes, it starts to get blunted, okay? And then it gets jammed in the wood or whatever you're trying to cut into. And so if you could overcome the pressure on the sides to stop it getting wedged, and it doesn't get blunted, its cutting would be so much deeper and would have much higher chances of even cutting metals like other steels. And so those are the advantages if you had something like adamantium also. Now, when you come into enchantments, this becomes very case specific. So with Sunicles in my book setting, when you sunforge any object, and this is just not only weapons can be sunforged, by the way, there is a supernatural enhancement that comes from the magical light that you're infusing into the object that increases its functional ability for whatever purpose it was made for. Now, of course, swords are meant to cut and thrust, and so on top of its mechanical advantages, Imperius has a supernatural magical enhancement to its cutting capacity on top of that, which basically means it can essentially cut through all normal materials except other sunforged objects. Sunforged armor and anything that's sunforged has that near indestructible characteristic, and whatever the item is, the purpose that it was made for is supernaturally enhanced through this enchantment. So if you were to sunforged a hammer, it would drive in nails with the slightest tap. If you sunforge shoes, they grip way more than they should ever be able to grip, even in super slippery surfaces and stuff like that. And so that's how the enchantment works. And with weapons, of course, they cut much more. But of course, broadening that to fantasy generally, it's a very case-specific thing. If the magical enhancement is making it indestructible, like just basically as strong as anything, well, of course, like you would be limiting yourself by enchanting a weapon, a sword, that was made to operate under normal conditions. This one-handed arming sword here was made to get the most out of what is made from steel, okay? In terms of thickness, flex, and everything like that. If you knew that this weapon was going to be enchanted with some magical thing that made it stronger, you would actually make it far different, and you would take into account the ideas that we've talked about in regards to Imperius. Because remember, Imperius was specifically made for the purpose of it being sunforged, enchanted, and that's why it was made different, much thinner, and that's the same with a blade like this. And so the question kind of arises in, say, a classic fantasy setting, if they are able to enchant objects to be nearly indestructible, why are you enchanting steel? Why not enchant a wooden sword, which is technically what Imperius is, and let the magic make it nearly indestructible, and then you have a much lighter, nearly indestructible weapon that you can make much thinner. Basically, a lot of the things that we're talking about in Imperius, but this can be adapted into classic fantasy. Why aren't we enchanting wooden swords? Well, is at the edge. You can technically make wood as sharp, depending on the type of wood, okay, caveat, as sharp as steel, just won't hold that edge for very long at all. And I've even heard of accounts of cutting implements made out of wood. Wood that's like fire hardened and sharpened to give a cutting edge on wood. It has already existed in the real world. Their durability is spit, of course, especially against harder things, but against flesh, wood can be enough to cut through flesh, absolutely. And so you could make a wooden sword with a good solid cutting edge and enchant it with the magic of your setting, and it'll be way better than enchanting a steel weapon. And so it's kind of odd. It's like everyone is enchanting steel weapons, but the steel weapon was made to operate and exemplify the properties of steel, not the properties of the enchantment. Now, there's going to be too many enchantments to go through every single one, but I'm going to try and touch on some more prominent specific ones. Have you heard of the Vorpal Sword? The Vorpal Sword, it comes up in different fantasies and is represented differently in like different role-playing games, and so this isn't going to apply uniformly to every fantasy setting that has a Vorpal enchantment, but one of the interpretations I've had is a Vorpal enchantment enhances the damage, that all you need to do is cut someone a slight cut, and that cut can turn into a massive gash to sometimes just decapitating someone completely, even if you got the slightest nick. Now, if you had a weapon that you were going to give a Vorpal enchantment like that, you would honestly design it differently. All you need to do is land a cut. And so enchanting a weapon that had poor reach, okay, and was built around cutting is defeating the purpose. Honestly, you would get far more effect out of enchanting something with huge reach, where, like a weapon that gave you much greater chance of just landing a cut, a nick on your opponent, and you let the enchantment do the damage afterwards. And so enchanting swords like this, no, that would be rapier-like, okay, even in a stock or something like that, huge reach, and just, you know, a weapon that's focused around landing the tap, that's cut on the opponent, and it does the job for you. And so using that Vorpal enchantment on other weapons that were not designed to really take the most advantage out of the enchantment doesn't make sense, okay? So again, we need to look at the enchantment. What is the enchantment doing specifically, and then try and figure out, is this weapon optimized to take advantage of that magical enchantment? And what about fire? Okay, that's kind of a classic thing, like a weapon being wreathed in fire. Well, actual fact, is that going to be useful at all? Because it would burn people, but I mean, technically I feel deep cuts are more debilitating and devastating than burning someone. Having said that, burning can be really painful and intimidating. But in terms of cutting someone with a blade that was super hot, you're technically cauterizing the wound as you cut, which makes them less deadly. And so a fire enchantment might not be that great with a weapon at all, you know. In actual fact, fire enchantments might work so much better to be shot, like, you know, being able to shoot fire instead of just having to run in close and land a strike to get the fire damage on top of it. Poison, that's an interesting enchantment, okay? If you had a magical enchantment that made your weapon poison, I think that would come into the Vorpal thing as well. If you're relying on the poison to kill and not the actual cutting, you would, I feel, to take the most advantage out of it, you would put it on a weapon that, again, enables you, gives you greater advantage of just landing that touch. All you need to do is nick them for that magical poison to get into their blood, and so again, something much longer and everything. So it's funny, we're kind of falling towards rapier-like weapons. Is there an enchantment that makes so much sense for a more classic kind of sword, like a long sword? Well, a speed enchantment, all right? If you had an enchantment that on a weapon that just magically enhanced the speed in which you could cut with, well, that would have huge benefits on the depth and the severity of the cuts you can land with any type of cutting weapon or implement. Because again, speed is something that impacts the severity of the strike, and also from your resting position, if you have a guard position or whatever, and you can suddenly just jump forward into a massive strike and it's super fast. Again, well, that is an enchantment that suits, of course it would suit a rapier as well. A rapier is better in all things. Well, look, sometimes you want to cut to fend off more opponents than one, all right? And a rapier is nowhere near as good as cutting. Yet there are so many enchantments to consider, and honestly, too much if I tried to list them off in the video. I'd love your help. Share them in the comments below. What are some, you know, magical enchantments that would naturally affect weapon design, like swords? And are there, you know, enchantments that particularly suit, say, long swords or cutting like swords over other swords where, because they're designed, they would get greater benefit out of that enchantment specifically. I'd love to read them, so please do share them in the comments below.
So now I want to talk about and analyze some of the aesthetic liberties that you can take in your sword design when that sword's material properties are different, and that is whether from a magical enchantment or actually being made out of some different fantasy material. For instance, if the sword is considerably lighter, you can get away with adding additional elements that would have added unnecessary weight, but because it's already so light, you actually might want that little bit of extra weight to lower the point of balance and give you far more point control. Now, that would generally affect the striking power of the sword, but the reason why swords need a certain amount of heft in the blade is to help push apart the material it's trying to cut. The thicker the blade, the more resistance it runs into in this regard. But if the blade is really, really thin, it actually needs far less force to cut deeply. This is the exact logic I used with Imperius. I added some additional spikes, which, funnily enough, is what you often see on fantasy swords. They have spikes and aesthetic elements thrown in all over the place. I was far more conservative with Imperius, and the intent was to make it look like a flaring sun. Interestingly enough, these spikes have some functional value in that any sword strike that comes down can get caught in between these spikes if the person using it twists it at a certain angle, and you'd be able to lock away the opponent's sword. Would that lock away your own sword? Well, if you position your sword at the right angle, you could lock away theirs and then put yours on point for a counter attack. So when we look at the more cliche kind of fantasy sword designs, they often have bulbous, oversized hilts and pummels, and of course spikes everywhere. And like I said before, those sword designs could be far more plausible if the material the sword is made out of, due to, again, magic or the material itself, is considerably lighter. It is actually really useful to have your sword balanced in a certain way, and placing weight in areas to achieve that is very important. If the weight of this sword, made out of mystical materials or simply enchanted, is the same as, say, a normal sword, then you need to be aware of these visual embellishments and keep unnecessary weight low. Here's another fantasy sword design I've made that belongs to a superhero character. The sword is called Regalium, and in the hands of the wielder it feels as heavy as it naturally should according to its size and dimensions. Though to anyone else it actually feels like it weighs a full ton. That's one of its enchantments. And of course I wanted this sword to look really impressive and cool. One of the designs I went with are, again, different kind of spikes, but spikes seem to be just very common in fantasy swords. They add a cool aesthetic, I fully admit that. Yet being mindful of weight in sword design, if we look at this sword from a different angle, you'll notice the crossguard and the spikes are actually really thin. They're only 2 millimeters, and so the overall weight of the crossguard, including these side spikes, it would actually still be very low, because one of the other enchantments of the sword is, of course, it's indestructible. That means you don't need nearly as bulky a guard to maintain its strength when impacted. Another liberty that you can take in fantasy sword design are really exotic blade profiles. Now, you want to keep them in the realms of functionality, so these blade designs that have, again, spikes going off all on the blade on these random angles, no, horrible, bad, don't do that. Again, this was my logic with Imperius. You'll notice that the connection of the blade is a bit smaller, and the blade actually broadens out above it. It's not really a problem, but you could consider the connection point a weak part on the blade, but being indestructible, it can have this blade profile without any problems at all.
And so thank you very much for watching, and please do go check out Quantum Leap Cosplay. Honestly, it is an awesome YouTube channel. He deserves way more subscribers than he has. Please subscribe. And, I mean, if you've been interested in the properties that I've been talking about in regards to my book setting and Sonicles and Imperius the Magic Sword, well, my novel is out. It is available in ebook, print, and the audio book is either out or it's coming, okay? It's currently in review as the moment of filming this video, so you'll know in the description below. And the audiobook is narrated by Michael Kramer and Kate Redding. That is just phenomenal! Michael Kramer! In case you didn't know, Michael Kramer and Kate Redding, they voiced Wheel of Time audiobooks, Brandon Sanderson Stormlights, and my book! That's right! Shadow of the Conqueror, Chronicles of Everfall. They're narrated, it's awesome. And so yeah, check it out. It's my debut novel, it's awesome, it's got Imperius in it, and that's just one setting element amongst many other cool setting elements of the novel. So yeah, I hope you check it out, and of course I hope to see you in the next video. So until that time, farewell.